We're getting some attendees. Yay. Hi, everybody.
I'm going to shut this. Yeah, No, you're good. I'm just presenting.
Okay, I think we're ready to start.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get us started. First, I'll go ahead and introduce our panel. We have the lovely Michelle Flynn from Road Home, and we have Zach Bell from Housing Connect, and I am Andy Beatles from the Weber Housing Authority, and we are presenting on best practice implementation. So I'll get us started. The definition of best practice is a procedure that has been shown by research and experience to produce optimal results that is established or proposed as a standard suitable for widespread adoption. The two key words here are research and experience. And then why implement best practice? And we'll let Zach talk a little bit about this, and then we'll have Michelle pitch in after Zach shares his thoughts.
Yeah, okay. So I was thinking on this, it's kind of, it's things that work, right? As we navigate the landscape of all the work that we do. And, our focus here in particular is the intersection of homelessness and housing. So it's best practices in that realm. So the why, for a number of reasons. I think, so many of us really focus a lot on what impact we're making. We want to make the most impact possible with the time we've got, the money we have, and resources. And best practices align us with what's been found to work best. So that research part. Another why that seems to come up is around getting on the same page, alignment. So it's not just each individual person or situation that we're using kind of a best practice, but that systems, whether it's our teams, our organizations, that we line up behind that. I think as we kind of were putting this on, kind of getting ready for the presentation, we had such great examples around when we're in tune and align, and that's probably why best practices are important. And then we had some really great laughs around times we're not, and that probably is there's an element of best practice in that, of some doing this best practice, and maybe not everyone's aware. What do you think, Michelle?
I think some of the things I was thinking about on why we implement best practices. Another piece of that is supporting our staff and our teams and making sure they feel equipped and good about the work that they're doing, and that they understand what a best practice is, that they have the tools and the training to know and measure when they're, when things are working, and that they have places to go to for some guidance when they want to make some changes. And so I think it's important from a management perspective as a benefit and a way to support the team.
Definitely. Thanks, Michelle. One of the questions that we posed was, is it required? And sometimes best practices are required, and sometimes they're not. But as a general rule, it's good practice to adopt best practice in your agencies, even if it's not required. And again, it's based on that evidence and experience, and it's proven to be effective. Okay, so our next slide talks about how to provide support to staff implementing best practice. So we want to emphasize that this, like Zach said, this takes consistent and conscious effort, and reevaluating on a continual basis is to make sure that we're implementing these best practices. We continually need to be reminded of the core principles and asking ourselves and if our agencies are implementing these to the best of our ability. Zach, I'll let you speak now.
Yeah. Well, one thought that came up for me, I'm thinking I was going to look through like how many we have. I think we have like 6 we're going to go over. Maybe there's 1 or 2 more that came up when we were talking it through. One nice thing is, there's not that many things to pay attention to with best practices. Really what it helps us do is in the the kind of as we engage in the work and the chaos of the day, maybe there's only 6 main things that if we uphold those most, we probably do a really great job. And so I think that's one that can really help our staff. Is it's not everything. It's these core things, and we're gonna give some great details on the main best practices that we and I think our community really identify as the core approaches. One other that came up in kind of preparing is probably each of us and our organizations do this well in certain areas and not well in other areas. And I had that not well in some sense of like, oh gosh, how to talk to this. It's a good reminder of how important it is. And there's a lot of care and feeding to it where we can have a moment in time where we're really focused on it and then it can fall away. So I think we have some good info that we want to share around how do we keep this top of mind ongoing day in, day out.
And, having a regular training schedule is good and it is important. But on top of that, just having constant conversations about the work and sort of doing a review after some event might occur and talking it through and thinking, did we follow best practice? Could we have done something a little bit differently? That's just as important as those ongoing trainings. I know we talked about staff can move between roles and it can be tricky and we want to give them options. Our staff, for example, behind the front desk, they're in some ways they're there as, enforcing rules, but on the other hand, they need to meet the needs of the client. And so anytime anything, happens that the staff are concerned about, it's really important to have those times set in where you have, where folks know that they're going to be able to talk through and really look at it through a best practice lens.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Michelle. And I think providing support to staff just ensures a system of checks and balances. So making sure that we're holding each other accountable so that we can implement these best practices, our agencies. Okay, our next topic of conversation is why do we care about best practices? Let's see. So, will best practices provide a set of guidelines and ethics and ideas that represent the most efficient or prudent course of action? I think that's all we'll really say about this. One thing that we did talk about quickly is, like Michelle and Zach both said, it's important to make sure that you're checking yourself. So I'll give you a quick example. Somebody comes to your office somebody comes to the top of the coordinated entry waiting list that you've housed before, that owes you money, that has been verbally abusive to staff. They have been difficult to work with, and you might have these biases and think, I really do not want to serve this individual. And this is just a good example of making sure that you're then again stopping and saying, what is best for the client? Is this client-centered, and am I implementing these best practices and doing what's best for the client, not what's best for me or for my agency? Okay, so where do we start? Our group has picked among some of the best practices. We picked 6 that we felt were most important, and we're going to start with housing first. So we'll let Michelle explain and go over housing first.
Housing first. We say those words a lot, and I think a lot of us in this work have done research and have been at different presentations around housing first. But it's another good reminder to think about this and regularly have discussions around what Housing First means in your agency and your programs. Housing First is really a philosophy. It's not a program. It's a philosophy that overlays all the work that you do. I know in our agency, the Housing First philosophy back in 2005, and we used that and looked at all the programs and all the different work that we did and made sure that we were bringing in those principles. I know sometimes people think permanent supportive housing and Housing First go hand in hand, and they do, because permanent supportive housing is operated in a Housing First model. But so is rapid rehousing, and so is provision of shelter. So what is Housing First? If you want to move to the next slide, Andy. Um, it's immediate access to safe, affordable, and permanent housing. And that what that really means is nobody should be living on the streets or in a shelter for any longer than they need to be. And so Housing First means we're working with that individual to provide the quickest way to end their homelessness. It means that there's no housing readiness requirements. Everyone who's experiencing homelessness um, should be in housing. There's a housing option that's going to work for them. Consumer choice is very important. So choice is a key part of Housing First. We work with individuals who have lots of different needs and self-determination. And it's important that we listen and we help them with what they want and what they're asking for. These services in Housing First are voluntary. So a lot of our programs have case managers and housing locators and all kinds of supports and partnerships in place. But we know that the individual who's experiencing homelessness um, needs to decide that they want to engage in those services. And if we try and impose services on folks and it's not what they are looking for, they don't understand, then it's not going to work. And Zach will talk a little bit more about motivational interviewing. Um, and then practices and policies to keep people in their own home. That's a really important part of Housing First. And I will say, Housing First is not housing only. And we've heard a lot of that in recent times. Criticisms around Housing First, that Housing First is housing only. It's like the opposite of housing only. It means that we meet the needs of the person who is looking for housing, and then we find out what are those supports, what are those uh, types of services, support systems in the community that are going to help you stay in your own home, that we're working with you so that you understand your lease and that you know where to go and how to talk with the landlord when there's issues. It's all very supportive of the individual or family in order to have them stay housed. Okay, I'm almost out of time, but really Housing First is simple. It's not easy. It's definitely not easy, but it's simple. And Housing First believes that nothing that in any person's history or in their present circumstances will prevent them from being able to be housed. Um, while there are definitely challenges sometimes to getting into housing and maintaining it, the goal is the same. And we know that housing is the solution to homelessness. I will leave it there.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle. Our next best practice is harm reduction. So we'll let Zach talk about harm reduction.
Great. I think this one too, like what Michelle said, is a philosophy more than anything, with then some activities below it. What are the things we need to believe or lean into to make the work we do accessible and available? So I like these as kind of back to back. So this is a pretty critical philosophy that we need to adopt if we're going to serve folks who may be engaging in behaviors that, one, could be harmful, might also be easy to have some judgment about what folks do, and what do we do with that, right? How do we kind of navigate around it? A couple, maybe just quick on kind of definition. It really is, interventions at reducing some of the negative effects of behavior, but maybe a little bit of distance from, like, we want that thing to change and really kind of getting in there concrete. So it's unattached from whether the behavior changes or not. that's some of the other best practices that might help with it. A couple examples on this. One pretty common with folks that we encounter on the street. I'll use a youth example. This is one we've encountered, gosh, many times. Youth on the street, they're using, and let's say smoking meth, and it's not maybe all that helpful. It's probably maybe a little harmful, but really finding out what is driving some of the behavior can be critical to harm reduction. So in one scenario, it's pretty common for them to say, well, one, it's winter time. It helps make me feel warm. It helps keep me awake and alert because sometimes people have done bad things to me. So as we approach that, one, we want this person to, really to be very clear, to be alive long enough that we can help them be better. And harm reduction is a tool for that. So let's jump to the next slide. So this is we'll send out some resources. There's a great article that talks about kind of the intersection of housing and harm reduction. So down on the bottom left, harm reduction services. So what does that look like? So a couple examples. One, use detox. Common that, for someone that's maybe coming off alcohol, other drugs, there's some talk of, well, what do you do with smoking? And one of the things that's been kind of debated, but a harm reduction approach would be, well, let's allow folks that come into detox to continue to smoke. And maybe even the research shows that if it's not full cold turkey, that might help their journey to sobriety. And then let's work on some of that other stuff at some point in the future. In housing, other examples, let's say in one of our permanent supportive housing sites, we have someone who is really using, they're kind of just full on. And it may even jeopardize some of their housing. Let's say stuff is escalating where they might get evicted. And we know they have some money coming in. So harm reduction might look like working with them. Maybe they have a payee. Well, can we see if they buy into an approach where we titrate some of that money? So maybe they still can maybe drink, but maybe not in such a kind of the quantity that's currently leading to a not so great outcome. But it pulls things in control enough where housing can be preserved. Hopefully what's heard is it's not full on condoning things. I think that's some of the philosophy thing that maybe we struggle with at times is that's not right. That shouldn't be happening. Let's put some rules in place. But what we see with some of the folks we work with is behavior probably more likely than not is going to continue. What do we do with that? So the inclusion part, making it work for all, I think is a critical aspect. Michelle mentioned that around choice, both in housing, but also the ways that we approach. So it's really working with an individual on, are you concerned about what's going on and how can we help? The organizational infrastructure, this is the big philosophy piece. We have to be aligned. So a quick housing example, we could build housing for folks that may be coming out of treatment or actively using. If we didn't implement a harm reduction plan from a housing perspective, we'd probably evict everyone. And then great that we'd have this nice building that's not serving anybody because our philosophy and views are not aligned. So a really critical best practice to implement and probably talk about more than we do. This one I think can have some tough elements to it, but it sure is a critical one.
Perfect. Thanks, Zach. I agree with you. In our communities, I think harm reduction is one of the most controversial of the best practices. Okay, our next best practice is coordinated entry. And I'll go ahead and talk about coordinated entry. So coordinated entry is an approach that allows a homeless system to prioritize and connect housing services and interventions that will rapidly end homelessness for individuals. So coordinated entry has a lot of parts. And so I'm just going to talk about some of the qualities of an effective coordinated entry system. So the first is prioritization. So making sure that the people with the greatest needs in your community receive a priority for all housing services. And then the next one is low barrier. So making sure that we're not screening people out for any preconceived barriers. So things like drug use or alcohol use or criminal activity or lack of employment. The next one is a housing first focus. So making sure that there are no service participation requirements, just like Michelle talked about, and that also individuals have a choice in their housing. The next quality is person-centered. So again, this has to do with participant choice, and that can include location and type of housing, the level of services, or really anything that allows the individual to provide choice in their housing, in the housing process. The next quality is fair and equal access. So this means that all people, all homeless individuals in the geographic area have fair and equal access to the coordinated entry process. And sometimes this takes a lot of work. We want to make sure that individuals that are sleeping on the streets receive the same access to services as those sleeping at the shelter, and that youth are receiving the same access to housing as homeless veterans. So that's kind of what fair and equal access refers to. The next quality is emergency services. So we don't want coordinated entry to delay access to emergency services such as shelter. The next quality is standardized access and assessment. So we want to make sure that we're using the same assessment approach. We often refer to this as no wrong door. And what this means is that as individuals present, they're receiving the same standardized assessment. And in Utah, that's the SPDAT. So hopefully everybody has adopted and their communities are using the SPDAT to provide housing to individuals on the coordinated entry waiting list. The next quality is inclusive. We want to make sure that we're including all subpopulations so that we're not leaving out youth or homeless veterans and the big one I think is DV victims. We're making sure that even DV victims have equal access to homeless housing services. And that there's not multiple coordinated entry lists for different subpopulations. This is included in this inclusive quality. We need to make sure that we're continuously evaluating and improving this process. The next quality is referrals. So we need to make sure that in coordinated entry, we're referring to all projects receiving any of the COC funding, ESG funding, and in addition to any of the community resources that are available locally. The next quality is outreach. And so we need to make sure that individuals that are residing in places not meant for human habitation have equal access to coordinated entry. And this is tricky, especially for smaller communities. And our community used to be one of these communities where we didn't have good outreach on the streets. And those individuals that were sleeping in places meant for human habitation didn't have access to homeless services like those that were residing in the shelter. Outreach is a critical piece of the coordinated entry process. We want to make sure that, again, all individuals, regardless where they're sleeping, have access to coordinated entry. The next quality is ongoing planning. We need to continually be evaluating and updating the coordinated entry process, and our stakeholders need to be involved in that. They need to provide input and need to be aware of what's happening. Let's see. We need to leverage local resources and capacity, and we need to inform, these need to inform the local coordinated entry implementation. And then safety planning, this is in reference to DV victims. We want to make sure that our DV victims are, even though they're on the waiting list, the homeless waiting list, that that we're doing that safely. So making sure that either we're using an alias or some kind of unidentifying information, but that they still have equal access to the homeless services. We also need to make sure that everything is confidential through the coordinated entry process. The next quality is using HMIS. And then finally, full coverage. So we need to make sure that the entire geographic area is covered through coordinated entry. So again, coordinated entry can be tricky, and there's a lot of moving parts for coordinated entry. And I think this is another one of these practices that needs continual evaluation. One of the recommendations was that on a yearly basis, communities look at their policies and look at how they're running coordinated entry to make sure that they're implementing these and that they do have qualities, or excuse me, that their processes are effective. Okay, so our next best practice is motivational interviewing, and Zach is going to cover motivational interviewing.
Great. So this is one of those tools that really is squarely in the work of change. So I think we're in the business of change, and when we work with folks. It's a goal-oriented style of communication. So we'll model a little bit of it, but working around one's goals, and there's an element of resistance that we'll talk about. So to start, I got a Stephen Pressfield quote. So most of us have two lives, the life we live and the unlived life within us. Between the two stands resistance. And I believe this is true for us. It's true for any person that we interact with. There's a critical element there of that resistance. And, we think about any change, we often talk about, well, it's tough. Humans and change don't always go together. And what do we do with that? So let's jump to the next slide. Okay, so on the left, so this is probably many of you have know of or are familiar or heard some of the words on the stages of change. And so this is, just established framework of really how humans work in terms of when we take on any these are the steps that this goes through. So pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and then we always have some relapses. It can be as simple as sticking with one's morning habits to moving into housing and how those things go. So that's a critical part to kind of have in mind as we look at this and kind of the role of motivational interviewing. So what it's not telling people what to do. What it is, it's person-centered. So really us really getting toe-to-toe with individuals and learning, finding out about what kind of makes them tick, what they're interested in at the current time, and uses a process. So one of the acronyms, ORS, is a pretty common one of the frame of how this works. So questions, asking a lot of questions, much more questioning than telling. And then support and affirmation. With motivational interviewing, one of the critical elements, and just as us as people, we want to be seen and we want to be heard and we want to be acknowledged. So part of this kind of engagement approach really lands on that. Reflective listening. So this part is maybe others can see parts of ourselves that we can't see ourselves. And so using this as a method to tease that out, is what I heard this, or is what you're saying this? And then summarizing really helps connect the dots. So we may not get that one part might be really bumping into the other. So a quick client example in terms of the change that we might really be helping someone through, moving from the street to housing. Thinking of an individual, there's probably a scenario for many we've encountered, moves into housing. There's a whole bunch of steps to that. Tons of paperwork, signing one's name, a lot of different words around what this ties you to. You move into your housing, and now let's say one's been living on the street. Now you're in housing and you're alone, and maybe your connections aren't there anymore. So while we can look at that and say that's really good, there's also some really hard things that we nudge or ask or assist those we serve with. making sure that they're in the driver's seat is a pretty critical element. So I don't know, I'll do a quick, I don't know if Andy or Michelle, you got something right now that you're either struggling with or something about change?
Go ahead, Michelle.
I'm
Do you-
unprepared.
Any life thing?
So what about struggling with a defiant child?
Okay, perfect. So child. So Andy, what? Just tell me about that. What do you want to come out of it with this kind of your kid and what's going on?
I want them to listen and be obedient and do what they're told.
Okay, so listen, obedient, do what they told. What's the hard part about it?
It's hardest for me when my daughter, when she's given, what's the word, things that she needs to get done. So she has chores, let's say, and she chooses to play with her friends instead of do her chores. That's really hard for me because then I turn into the bad guy and I have to nag.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like that part's hard, and probably happens, I'm guessing, somewhat frequently.
Yes.
Yeah. What part what part may come up for change for you? What might you need to change?
Well, I don't think I need to change anything. I think my daughter needs to change. But I can change the way that I approach the situation.
Okay, so maybe changing your approach. Tell me a little bit just on like the scale, so kind of the ruler, 0 to 10. Like where would you put yourself on 0? Like not willing to change at all. 10, like I'm already there. I'm so excited to change.
So I would say probably a 7 or an 8.
A 7 or 8, like pretty willing.
Yeah.
And what about knowing what you need to do? Like 0, I have no idea what I need to do. 10 to like, or excuse me, 0, I don't know at all. 10, I know exactly what I need to do. I just need to do it.
Maybe I have some ideas that might work better than the approach that I'm trying. So maybe 6.
6. And what would it take to get to like an 8 on that one?
Maybe if I solidified my thoughts and picked one of the options that I feel like would work better with my daughter.
Okay, like hone in and kind of find the thing and then kind of say that's the one I want to work on.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks. So there's a quick flavor. So of kind of just some motivational interviewing, hopefully to give kind of the excitement around. It's really leaning in, focusing on who those we're helping, what change they want. Motivation has to come from them. So thanks, Andy.
You're welcome.
That's what I get on that. Hopefully that's good flavor for the value of that as a tool.
That was perfect. And we'll talk about motivational interviewing, I think, through the rest of our best practices. So our next best practice is trauma-informed care. And so we'll let Michelle cover trauma-informed care.
Thanks, and great job, Zach.
Yeah, thanks.
Skills at work. Okay, so trauma-informed care. We've done a lot of learning around trauma-informed care in our community over the last few years. Great support in our state and in our cities and counties and amongst service providers to embrace learning more about trauma-informed services and what they mean in homeless services specifically, and why it's important to know these things and how to put them into practice. So if you want to flip to the next slide, thank you. So key principles. What are the key principles of trauma-informed care? Trauma-informed care is really a system. It's an overall system that identifies and realizes that there is a widespread impact of trauma and that we are understanding what those potential paths for recovery are. We recognize the signs and the symptoms of trauma in the people that we're serving, and the individuals that we're involved in partnering with. And then we respond by fully integrating the knowledge about trauma into our policies, our procedures, and our practices in our agency. with a goal of really seeking to actively resist re-traumatization. So as we know, and I think we all instinctively knew this before we even heard the words of trauma-informed care, that homelessness itself is a traumatizing experience. And usually by the time someone shows up at our front doors at the road home, they've been through a lot and a lot of trauma. And there's some science behind trauma and how it affects the brain. I know there's a number of sessions on trauma-informed care tomorrow in the summit where you'll be able to dig a little bit deeper into some of that background. But I wanted to talk about just a couple of components of it. And one is a simple thing that we really benefited from a lot was creating a trauma-informed environment and the space that you're working in, having a really thoughtful, a proactive way of looking at the spaces that are around you and seeing how's it affecting someone in this room. What does the physical nature look like? What kind of pictures are on the walls? We know plants and greenery and windows are really important. Are spaces clean and uncluttered? Is the lighting good or is the lighting harsh? That we're using calming colors. And for us, a big one, and one that we have to consistently be looking at, is signage. What are the signs that are around? Are we having clear signage so people can easily know where to go to get the help that they need? We realized when we started down this road that we did not. Somebody would come into a shelter and they wouldn't know where to go. It was not clearly signed. It was just something we hadn't thought through. And then when we do have those signs, make sure the wording is very trauma informed. And so I know when we all in Salt Lake County went through, building new shelter resource centers, we were able to talk about trauma informed spaces and even with the architects, but as we moved into the buildings, really look at the spaces and how we were creating spaces to enable the kind of work that we wanted to get done. Sometimes signs just pop up. And any of my team that's on this call will know that this is a little pet peeve of mine. Every time you walk around, all of a sudden there's like 3 or 4 more signs and you're like, what's that? What's that about? And sometimes, instead of saying no food allowed in the dorm, the signage instead says, let's keep a clean dorm and keep it pest free. Eat downstairs on the dining room table, so just kind of twisting, turning around how you're communicating with people can be really important and helpful. Another area that I think is important to think about is de-escalation techniques. And when you're interacting with someone in a situation you're trying to de-escalate, this is where we found a great deal of benefit in really having our staff know and understand trauma and how it's affecting the people we're serving. It helps you as staff rethink the experience you're having with someone who might be agitated and how you might work with them in a de-escalation manner and recognizing own signs in you when you start to get agitated in reaction to how someone else is acting. So it's a really key area to focus on. So a move towards a trauma-informed service agency is a move towards safety focused. We want people to feel safe, strength-based. We want people to feel stronger in every single interaction that they have with one of our staff. We want them to walk away feeling more safe and stronger to move forward with what they want to do. Again, that it's very participant driven. You're going to, this is consistent throughout all of our best practices. And really we have an empowerment rich programming throughout our agency. That's really our overall goal, to be a trauma informed agency. We know that we really want to work in our community. A lot of our organizations, I know we've had training for every staff person, whether it's accounting staff person or janitorial staff person or case manager. We want all of our team to know and understand what trauma-informed services are and feel equipped. And then we also benefit, and the people that we're serving benefit, when all the agencies that they're interacting with are also have that lens of services. So trauma-informed care really supports all the other best practices. We've talked about that. You can hear that. Low barrier shelter, housing first, motivational interviewing. I know one of the things that came up a lot in our shelter operations when we were first rolling out trauma-informed care is that, you know, our staff who are working behind the desk sometimes felt like, well, then the guest gets to do whatever they want. And if you know, if they're yelling at me or I'm feeling bad about what's happening, then, you know, I have to not address that because I have to remember where they're coming from. And that's not it at all. You know, the safe atmosphere is for the people we're serving, but also for our staff. And you know, it empowers our staff and strengthens our staff ability to work in those situations. So this is a, you know, a deep investment in really learning and understanding how do we translate trauma-informed care into providing low barrier shelter and housing first, where we want to motivate people. We want people to end their homelessness quickly. And at the same time, we want to have a safe place, and we want to make sure we're addressing when people's behaviors are not contributing to a safe atmosphere, and how do we do that? And so it really overlays all the work that we do, and is related to all the other best practices. So if you want to learn more, there's some great sessions, as I said, on the calendar for tomorrow afternoon.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle. That was very beautifully said. So our final best practice that we're going to talk about today is housing case management. And housing case management actually incorporates all of the best practices that we've been talking about. There needs to be a focus on support and strengths. Strategies need to be housing focused. There needs to be coordination between tenants and landlords. There does need to be goal setting and building and community orientation. And so I just want to talk a little bit about a few of these. So first of all, like Michelle talked about empowerment, this is what is housing case management is empowerment focused and strengths based. And so we need to remember that services are not tied to housing assistance. The client gets to determine when and how often and where meetings take place. All services are client-centered. And so this can be tricky, I think, as a case manager that's working with, especially the homeless population. And I'll give you a really good example that happens in our office all the time. We conduct what's called an individual service plan with our homeless individuals that have recently been housed in our permanent supportive housing project. They come onto the program, and as they're completing their individual service plan, they identify as the #1 barrier and goal that they'd like to work on is getting a bicycle. That's their #1 goal. Whereas the case manager says, actually, I think your #1 goal needs to be working on your mental illness. You have this severe, or substance use. That's another really good one. But actually stepping back and saying, it's not about the case manager, it's about this individual. And if they want to work on a bicycle, finding a bicycle, getting a bicycle, let's work on that first. And not just first. And maybe the next time you meet about their individual service plan, they have something else, like they want to get a kitten. They've decided that they want a service animal and they'd like a kitten. You need to work with that individual on where they would like to be, and not the case manager's goals or expectations. Let's see, I used to have a professor in college that would say the client's right to self-determination. So we need to help them set those goals and then help them achieve those goals, making sure that they're aware of both the consequences and the rewards of those goals. Sometimes, actually I should say many times, the case manager will need to collaborate with the landlords, but still need to be an advocate for the client. They're on the side of the client and need to make sure that they're advocating to the landlords. And this can be kind of tricky sometimes. There is a fine line between helping and enabling, and we need to make sure that clients have the space and the capacity to problem solve. So they need to be able to solve their own problems without the case manager stepping in and enabling. And then also we need to make sure that we're identifying and linking households to community resources and not getting those services for the client. So making sure that you're just linking and not actually doing the work for them. It's so empowering for clients to be able to accomplish those kinds of things, and it helps them grow and become more self-sufficient. The more goals that they and community resources that they apply for themselves. Is there anything, Zach, do you want to, or Michelle, do you want to say anything about case management as well?
I got one just quick one. Visit the unit. I think it's important. So maybe one real important distinction between housing case management and maybe other forms of case management or care coordination. What it's not is only phone contact. I know COVID's thrown a real interesting element in the mix, but there's so much information that's gleaned with visiting our clients where they live, and also a preventative element of, is there anything, just getting eyes on. So I think that's a critical one. I think for any of the, probably more of like the kind of the treatment providers or kind of in the medical community, I think case management at times may have a bit of a different definition, more office-based, more phone-based. Not all, but I think those that have entered kind of the space of overlapping with housing, that's one of the elements that's become a common part of their approach.
I totally agree with you. It's so, I really do, you learn so much about the person in their environment. I totally agree with that. So thank you. Okay, the last thing we wanted to do is to provide a case study, and I'll read this to you really quickly. I think we have until 12:30, and then so I'd like to read this to you, and then we'd like to open this up for discussion and conversation about how we can use these best practices that we've gone over today to approach this situation. So bear with me while we read this. Sandy moved into housing last month after a lengthy 6-month housing search on your rapid rehousing program. She suffers from severe PTSD after a highly traumatic and abusive marriage involving a near-death experience at the hand of her abuser. She was recently approved for SSI in the amount of $803 per month. Sandy's household comprises of herself and her 2 children, ages 2 and 3. Sandy's previous eviction and poor credit made locating suitable housing difficult, but you were able to work with a landlord sympathetic to the program to work around the screening barriers. She has remained stably housed for 2 months. Unfortunately, Sandy has refused to pay her portion of the rent this month, which is 30% of her monthly income. And several neighbors have complained to the landlord about the volume at which she watches TV. Sandy receives a 3-day notice to pay her vacate and a noise violation from the landlord. Sandy travels 45 minutes on the bus with her 2 children to get to your agency. She enters your building and proceeds to verbally harass the front desk worker and is immediately asked to leave the building. As Sandy's caseworker, how can you utilize the best practices reviewed in this presentation? And Stephanie, if we can open this up for discussion, that would be so great.
Yes, if anyone has anything that they would like to contribute to the discussion, please use the raise your hand feature on the bottom of your screen, and someone will call on you and allow you the ability to unmute and speak.
Thank you.
We're not going to call on people, but we can see your names.
I was thinking the same.
I mean, I'll say one of the things that, you know, is common, and maybe this can help spark it, is this, you know, mom having to travel for 45 minutes on the bus with her 2 children, and the stress of that kind of a trip, along with the money she had to pay for that trip, you know, definitely speaks to why perhaps wasn't kind in her words with the front desk person. So I think
Yeah, while we're waiting, I look at it kind of being, I have some similar elements. I have 2 little kids. I can only imagine what trying to maintain housing when one has kids, and the stress and the just the primal need for that, what the weight of that one experiences.
All right, we have Brittany Prysock. Please say where you are from.
Hi, I'm from the Road Home. So I was just going to speak to one of the practices because I know there's a few people on here who could definitely shed some great light on how they could approach the situation. But I would personally begin with motivational interviewing and just kind of figure out how her process and day was just getting to me to start with, and then kind of what led up to her seeking out my services that day.
Beautiful. Yes. Thank you, Brittany. That's so important. And we, as we were preparing this, we talked about that a lot. So, yeah, finding out what the situation is. At this point, we don't know why she's not paying her rent. We're not sure what the noise or the noise violation is about. We need to gather more information, and utilizing the motivational interviewing best practice would probably be the best place to start. So thank you so much.
Okay, so we also have Travis James. Travis James, would you please tell us where you're from?
Yeah, it's Travis with the Housing Authority of Ogden.
Hi, Travis.
How's it going?
Good.
You guys did a great job.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say what we like to stress is it's kind of a balance, you know. We both have responsibilities and try to stress that from the beginning.
Yeah, definitely. And and I think, I do think, like we talked about with Housing First, it's not housing only. We need to make sure that even though she is in this incredibly tense situation, she needs to know it's not okay to verbally harass the front desk staff. Like we talked about, we need to start with motivational interviewing, but then make sure that she's being, and we can still be compassionate while doing this, but we do need to make sure that that's addressed.
So maybe there's a quiet room close by that we can bring her to start those conversations.
Absolutely. Yes, definitely. And focus on that trauma informed. Obviously, she has some severe trauma. She suffered from PTSD, and that would be very helpful, especially it sounds like tension. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of stress. Help de-escalate the situation in a private room. Yeah.
And I like that, thinking about the, if part of our goal is to readdress the expectations or the rules, or, maybe get some acknowledgement of that on the part of the client, the main path that's going to be successful is to also show respect, hear them, get in a container of space where there's some mutual regard around, let's have a real conversation, but to be able to listen. And if just the same as, it's so easy for either side to get shut down in some way. So how do we keep the lines of communication open so that we can even arrive at like, yeah, I get that probably wasn't good to do, but I got a whole bunch going on, and then the conversation begins at that point.
Absolutely, definitely. And I didn't mention this throughout our presentation, but I do want to emphasize that all of these best practices, while they are best practices, are something that we continually have to work at, and none of us are perfect at, and we continually have to readdress how we're implementing these strategies. We're not perfect at them. Our agencies aren't perfect at them, but it's important, I think, to do the best that we can with the information that we have. So we're happy to entertain anything else on this case study, or does anybody have any questions for our panel?
Looks like we have Monty Hanks. Go ahead and say where you are from, Monty.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Good. I just wanted to mention one thing, and it's happened over years of experience. When you're confronted like that, and in the middle of that, a front desk receptionist person is just hit like that all day long, probably, and it becomes very difficult to get anything straight in your head sometimes.
Yes.
And quite often, you'll have a manager or they'll call someone for assistance. But the one thing that I like to start with, which helps often diffuse it and open up a conversation, is deliver the good news first. The good news is we really want to help you with this issue. And then from there, quite often, not always, there's no magic words, believe me, but you can start that in that manner. Often it kind of redirects their thought process when they realize that you want to help me. It gives pause on both sides. Simple little thing. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Monty. That's great.
I love that. That was beautifully said.
And it's why we do the work, it seems. So we may not always have that front and center, but if we pause enough, take a breath, like that's pretty easy to say, because I think that's why all of us are here.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, and then we have one from Cheryl Whitney at DWS.
I just have to throw this out there before she starts talking. Cheryl is one of my favorite people on the planet. So go ahead, Cheryl.
There it goes.
Oh, am I good now?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah.
Okay. I was just going to say, I think we've all, and Andy's one of my favorite people. Our whole area, I love them all. But I think one thing that we've learned with COVID is what can we do at the beginning of that scenario to maybe meet her or ensure that she has the ability to get to our office.
Yeah.
Or, we've all had to adapt with everything that's been going on, and sometimes it is, can I meet you here instead of you coming all the way here, and just try to get some of that situated at the beginning, because we normally know what their situation is.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Yeah.
Great comment, Cheryl. I'm constantly just so grateful and impressed by the ways that our team has come up with to connect with the people that we serve. I know on our facilities, we're doing a lot of virtual meetings, including employment meetings with Department of Workforce Services and healthcare providers, and really just doing everything we can to connect people with services.
I would second the same, Michelle. I think COVID really has changed things, and all throughout all the best practices, it's really client centered. And we made some modifications. I'm thinking of our lobby, and one of the first, if not, I think was the first thing we thought of is how do we get, if we're going to change that, how do we get the word out? So similar to this scenario, we don't have someone that travels for far long and using money they could probably spend better on other things to get to our office to find that it's closed, and to preempt almost so many of the decisions we make with what's the impact on the client, how's it going to go, can we, if it might have a negative consequence, how do we mitigate any of that, or can we lean into like how do we make it great?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's so true. That simple thing of the caseworker going to the client versus the client coming to the caseworker is, I think, very powerful and very helpful in trying to move forward.
And challenging. Communication is so important, and it is
Mhm.
true, especially in housing, when sometimes it's hard to get a hold of people. So, yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
One pitch at the end, I think you probably have caught some of our hints, just a system alignment thing. It's really important that not just we anchor these within our teams, well, do it by levels. It's critical that these are aligned all the way. We can have teams that have these best practices embedded, but if they're not embedded across teams that work with them, it can create some challenge. If leadership or administration isn't aligned, also some challenge, but also across agencies. And we've probably all had this where there's a agency that's the referral for a certain need, but we hesitate because we're not sure how a client might be received. That's probably a best practice thing of, do they hold the same philosophy on how accessing services works? And I think it really comes back to Andy, your element around coordinated entry. Those were all on that list for that reason, is for the system to work, we all need to be aligned. So one more kind of plug on that. It's a real critical part to make our work strong.
We have an opportunity with the coordinated state plan and local homeless coordinating committees and regional continuums of care to really work together to have good training and good knowledge resources throughout the entire system.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Any more questions?
Say we have about 1 more minute before Stephanie's going to close out the session. So if there are any final questions, you can raise your hand, and we'll probably have time for like 1 more question. Alrighty.
Well,
Thank you so much for your time. And special thanks to Zach and Michelle for providing their wisdom and their expertise.
Back at you, Andy. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you.
Alrighty, I think that wraps up, and we'll head to lunch.